So we are now moving to the cost side, right? And so when we start thinking of the cost side, you've got to remember that to figure out costs, I have to look at how the firm produces the output, right? So what the firm's doing is it's taking inputs and it's using these inputs, it's putting them together to produce an output that it is going to sell, all right? And so there are two elements to your cost then. One is, how do you actually do production? How do you actually combine these inputs in order to create an output? So that's the first thing we have to look at. And then we look at how the firm does the production, we then have to look at input prices. How much do you pay for these inputs? So the cost is going to depend on my production process and input costs for the inputs I'm using to make the output, right? So there is a two-step process to figure out the cost side. So we're going to start by really thinking about production first. Then we're going to start realizing that what's happening with production is quite complicated, and then we have to start integrating input prices to get from production to cost. So now we're going to look at production, right? So when we look at production, we have to start with the production process, which entails the firm producing a certain quantity of the good, right? This is the quantity of things I'm producing, like how many apples I'm producing, will become the volume, not the revenue, just the volume, is a function or depends on my inputs. And I'm going to use the symbol L for labor, K for capital. I could include land. So this labor and capital, remember, these were things that we talked about earlier when we did the production possibilities frontier, right? Where we talked really about what can you produce given your resources. So now we're doing that idea from the firm side. So when we start thinking of the production process, we're going to have to figure things out around three major ideas, right? The first is that while the environment the firm is in is perfectly competitive, actual production process takes some time. So for example, I might be in a competitive market. I can enter the apple market, but it takes some time to plant the tree and get the harvest. It might take me 2 years. I have to think about that. If I want to switch from apples to, say, oranges, then I have to figure out how to, change my trees and move my plantation somewhere else, right? So that takes some time. And it's not just in agricultural products. Think about garments. I might be doing my production or have my factories in Mexico. But then I figure out that I want to move my production from Mexico to Thailand. Now this is going to take a little time. I'm going to have to shut down the factory in Mexico. I'm going to have to restart a factory in Thailand. So what's going to happen is that we have to now start thinking of a time frame, right? So the first thing we're going to say is a firm, when it is making a decision to maximize profit, it's making a decision first in the short run. At the moment when it's actually operating with a fixed amount of inputs or buildings, it might be able to hire more or less workers, but maybe, it's got machines, right? It's got a certain level of fixed costs. So it's going to make a decision of how much to produce in the short run, because it might be that while I'm planning in the long run to move from apples to oranges, in the interim, while I've got these apple trees, I will still do something, try and make some money out of it while the switch is going on. So that's the short run. And then in the long run, firms are able to actually do the switching in production that they need. So what this means is, in the short run, you don't have quite so much entry and exit of firms, right? Because I'm still stuck. I'm trying to enter the market, but I'm not there yet. In the short run, you've got fixed costs, you've got sort of stuff that you're working through, and you don't have as many firms entering and leaving the market in that way. Maybe some firms will leave, but entering the market, you have to do your setup. Right? In the long run, that all works out. Right? And so we're going to see it's got different implications for how the firm makes decisions when I'm in the short run, when I'm thinking about what will I do in the next year. So think of yourself in college. You're in college in the short run, you're trying to figure out your costs in terms of which university should I go to, how much student debt should I get, which courses should I take, what's the opportunity cost there, right? And there is a short run question. I mean, I'm at UW Bothell, maybe I want to transfer to UW Seattle because it turns out that for this particular long run aim I have, they have a better set of public policy courses or whatever. But if, on the other hand, my aim is to do media production, then I might decide what I really need to do is to switch from UW Seattle to UW Bothell, because while UW Seattle has really good communications department in terms of production, we do a lot of work on media production. We do very good work with that. And so students come decide, so on, right? So if you're interested in human rights, we do the human rights seminar, and so a lot of people end up coming this way. So in the short run, you're making these cost adjustments and decisions. In the long run, you will be able to make the switches you need. But in the short run, you're going to have to work with your advisor. Okay, now that I am here, what do I do? What prereqs do I take so that they will transfer, right? So that's the kind of thinking, short run, long run. So first, we have to think of whether the firm's operating in the short run or long run, right? Where in the short run, there are fixed costs and there is less entry and exit of firms. In the long run, there are no fixed costs because you are actually able to finally sell off or get out of one set of inputs and move to another place and do your new set of inputs and so on. Right? The second thing, whether it's short run or long run, you have to think about is how to put your inputs together in order to produce output. Because there is more than one way to do production. So think, for example, construction. The National Capital Region of India, the NCR, which is the Delhi and Gurgaon and the area around that, is one of the fastest growing areas in the world. Right? Tremendous growth. Very, very rapid. Huge construction. One of the interesting things about this construction process is that it's very labor intensive. So you are building these tall buildings, 20 floors. But what you're doing is you're putting up scaffolding, and then you've got workers who literally are doing this by hand. They're carrying the cement up, they're carrying the bricks up, and they're putting it there. And the question is why? And a lot of people look at this and say, oh, this is weird. Why are they doing this? How backward? They don't have the technology. And the answer is no. It's because labor is cheap. Why would I spend tons of money to import tons of machinery to do the construction when it's a lot cheaper for me to just use the labor? So construction in India is very labor intensive. And they're building these huge factories. They're building these huge 20-story, 30-story buildings. Bypass, highway, very labor intensive. Right? Of course, they're using machines, but a lot more labor. In the US, on the other hand, and my city of Seattle right now, there is this very strange situation where housing prices are so high, we have a homelessness crisis. But at the same time, housing prices are very, very high, so people are selling their houses to real estate agents who then do construction there. So on my street and in this neighborhood, there's for sale signs everywhere. People are selling their houses for $750,000, $750 million, $1 million homes. No, $750,000. I exaggerate. I wish it was million. $750,000, $750,000. Or, there are, if you go closer to Green Lake, there are $1 million homes. And so how are those built? So in this area, they are not building 20-story flats. They're building 6 stories, 7 stories. It's only downtown that you see the high rises. Over here, it's, townhouses. But even the townhouses, they're ending up using machinery. They come with these huge machines, I don't know what they're called, that dig the earth up to remove the old house, things like that. And they're using lots of machinery. They're operating these cranes. And you wonder, why so much capital when the actual building is much smaller than what they're doing in India? In the US, production is capital intensive because labor is more expensive. So it's more expensive to hire, skilled labor. It's better to hire, to use a machine and then hire fewer laborers. So you make a decision to be capital intensive. All right? So that's one way to think about what you're doing. So it could be which is cheaper, and this could be dependent on the availability of the resource, how easy it is to access the resource. In the US, you also have much more capital intensive stuff because there's a lot of subsidy for the oil industry, for fuel. So fuel prices in the US are a lot lower than other parts of the world, including much lower than in India, for example. Over here you call it gas, we call it petrol. But the cost at pump of petrol in India is actually higher than the cost here, right? And so given the way in which oil prices work, capital intensive, fossil fuel intensive production does end up being prioritized, right? Cheaper to produce that way. So the first thing you want to think about is whether you're going to do labor intensive or capital intensive. And this is not just about whether you're producing manufacturing goods or agriculture. Because in agriculture as well, there's a vast difference between having these massive, tractors and sort of mass production of corn on these huge farms versus doing more labor intensive local market production and things like that. So first, you have to make a decision about whether you're going to be labor intensive or capital intensive. Second, this decision will depend possibly on the cost and availability of the inputs. You're doing the same output, you're producing buildings, but you're doing it in different ways. The second thing that can affect whether you do something more labor intensive or capital intensive may be the size of the market. This seems strange because I can understand availability of resources is one thing, but why size of the market? So I will give you another example. Cars versus personal boats. So, most people have cars in this part of the world. Most people don't have boats. But because we are Seattle and we have Lake Washington and, if you go to Lake Union, you can see, people keep their ferries there. People have a whole range of boats, and they're about the size of a car, if you think about it, right? I mean, some might be huge and some might be less, but about that size. Second thing you want to think about is, interestingly enough, what it takes technically to produce a boat and what it takes technically to produce a car is not that far apart. What do you need for a car? You need to figure out a motor, and then you need to figure out how to transmit the energy of the motor into the movement of the vehicle. And then you have to really think about, then there is the body or the shell that goes around it, which is made out of metal and which is sort of finished in certain ways. Interior, if you want, seating and so on. So the actual things that you need to make a boat are not that technically far apart. You need to know about machines, you need to be able to do the welding, to do the body of the boat, right? But cars and boats are produced very differently. Why is that? And the answer is because when you do cars, you're able to enter mass market production, huge volume. So what that means is you can actually do factory production on a large scale, which can be very capital intensive. So, think of Detroit, think of Ford Motor Company, think of sort of car production. It's like we usually think of it as factory production with, massive workers and lots of machinery and so on. Boat production doesn't work that way because you don't have a mass market for boats. So it doesn't make sense to try and adopt the technology, the capital intensive technology that you use for cars, because the scale you need for that is really not worth it given how much demand there is for boats, because you have to be it's a small population, you have to be pretty rich to buy a boat and so on. So in that case, what happens is that you start producing the boats much less capital intensive, more labor intensive, skilled labor, smaller workshops and so on. And so you begin to realize this choice of technique, which is what it is called. Firms make a choice of technique. And they have to make a choice about whether they're going to use capital intensive or labor intensive. And that scale of production large-scale production, small-scale production. Right? And so these decisions are often determined by the size of the market that these firms are catering to, and by the availability of inputs in the area that they are operating and how cheap it is, which input is cheaper, right? So this is the decision the firm's going to make. And so with this in mind, we're going to take a closer look at the actual production process that is going on in making something.